This is Bernhard Ruchti, and this is the second segment of my introduction to my recording of Robert Schumann's masterpiece, the Fantasy in C major, Opus 17. In this segment, I'm going to talk about tempo issues with this piece, as it is a super interesting and fascinating case. Actually, it's also a wonderful general example of how we can find out about tempo options in any piece of the 19th century. As sources for the Fantasy, we have the first edition that came out in 1839 and was supervised by Schumann himself. We also have an autograph and a copyist's manuscript. The autograph particularly offers a lot of additional information and insight about Schumann's ideas and intentions of certain passages and their interpretation, and I will come back to that later. And we also have metronome markings given by Schumann. Now, Schumann and the metronome, that's a complex combination. In general, his music is anything but squeezable into a fixed form. So a stable beat is like the opposite of what his music is about, particularly in that period we're talking about here. In addition, some of his metronome markings are amazingly fast. And this was a topic of discussion and speculation already in the 19th century. Hans von Bülow, for instance, the famous pianist, conductor and writer, talks about this issue in his edition of some etudes by Kramers, which he did in 1868. He discusses the metronome markings given by Kramers and mentions both Beethoven and Schumann in this context. I quote, he starts talking about Kramers. With regard to the metronome signs, which have been copied exactly from the original, we cannot conceal that many of them appear to us exaggerated in speed, not merely as regards the pace for practicing, but also for their tempo as a piece of music. It is possible that, as in the case of Beethoven and Schumann, the latter of whom used a defective Melzel during the whole of one of his creative periods, the compass of J.B. Kramers' metronome stood to our normal pyramid as Fahrenheit to Réaumur. End of quote. So basically he says that some of Schumann's metronome markings are inaccurate and way too fast, and as an explanation he claims that Schumann's metronome must have been defective. Now, insinuating that Schumann's metronome didn't work properly is one thing. Another thing is asking about the metronome markings themselves. In my introduction videos to Beethoven a tempo, I've talked about a very old and traditional way of counting that was still used during both Beethoven's and Schumann's lifetime. It's mainly about the fact that historical sources suggest that some composers of the 19th century seem to have used the metronome differently than we do it today. If this is the pendulum of a metronome, today we count 1, 2, 3, 4. And some of the composers back then went on counting 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, which refers to the very old metric and conducting tradition that goes back to the Renaissance period. As a result, of course, the actual tempo or the actual beat that is being counted becomes much slower. This understanding of metronome markings and of counting is called double beat. If you'd like to learn more about that, just watch my Beethoven a tempo introduction videos. So, this old tradition metric double beat way of counting metronome markings was still around during Schumann's lifetime. So when we see that his metronome markings were questioned already by people in the 19th century, it seems a legitimate question to ask if double beat was perhaps something Schumann actually had in mind for some of his metronome markings. The first question, therefore, is what can we find out about Schumann in general before we have a closer look at the C major Fantasy? And there something very interesting appears. I would like to show you an example out of his Opus 2, the Papillon. There are 3 pieces out of that work that are written in a 3/8 bar. Now look what Schumann indicates as a metronome marking. This is number 7, and here he says dotted 8th note or dotted quaver equals 58. Now that's a weird way to count a 3/8 bar. We either count the whole bar as 1, or we count each single 8th note, but not the dotted 8th note. Since this appears 3 times in the first edition, it can't be a misprint. So what does Schumann mean? Obviously, he wanted to count the whole bar as a full vibration, like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So basically 1 full beat for the whole bar. But since he knew that the whole bar or the full beat consists of 2 single beats, and that people perhaps would get confused if he gave them the whole bar, he made the effort and calculated the single beats that correspond with the full vibration. So that is something pretty extraordinary. Now, this doesn't prove anything yet, of course, but it's still interesting that obviously he thought in full vibrations. And he was aware of the fact that any full vibration, any beat, consists of 2 single beats. So that again means that obviously he was familiar with the basic idea of double beat. It is also interesting, or even more interesting, to see that Clara Schumann, his wife, changed that metronome marking to dotted quarter note or dotted crotchet in her edition. As you can see here. There are 2 possibilities to explain that. She either thought that it was an error by Schumann, or, and this is a fascinating option indeed, she saw through Schumann's intentions and transformed that metronome marking given by Schumann into a regular double beat metronome marking. Because if you count that as double beat, you get as single beats this result, which is exactly what Schumann noted. And this, of course, would mean that she as well was familiar with a double beat understanding of metronome markings. Now that's speculation, of course, as she never talked about metronome markings, but it is still striking and a very interesting fact to think about. Now let's move on to the Fantasy Opus 17. The last movement is a triple measure as well. It's a 12/8 bar. And here Schumann indicates quarter note or crotchet equals 66. Now that's also kind of weird because no one would count regular quarter notes for a 12/8 bar. But it's not that unusual to find metronome markings like that. since the 12/8 bar consists of 4 parts, as you can see here, it is possible to write quarter notes equals 66, referring to the quarter parts of this bar structure, which would mean that it would be the same as dotted quarter note equals 66. That's how Clara Schumann understands it, and it indicates it in her edition, as you can see here. She actually changed it to dotted quarter note equals 60, so a little bit slower. The other option is that this is a double beat indication as well, which means that we would hear 2 ticks for every quarter note. So the ticks would actually be the 8th notes. And then we would just hear the ticks along with the 8th notes, and there wouldn't be any weirdness to it. So there are 2 options for this. Once again, this is no conclusive proof for anything, but it shows that double beat understanding of metronome markings is sort of around or in the air when it comes to Schumann's music. And that is the main thing that counts for us at this point. Now, what can we find if we dive more into the fantasy and all of its movements? What can we find out about tempo and about interpretation of this fantasy? That I'm going to talk about in the next segment. So please subscribe to my channel, don't forget to like and ring the bell to get notified.